Okay, I think we're going to get started. Everyone, thank you for coming. We really appreciate this. We're getting the hang of technology, so I'm going to try and do a screen share because I have a little PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to try and get that started. So everyone just bear with me. Okay, so I guess I'll introduce myself. Hey everyone, my name is Brandon West. I'm running for City Council in the 39th District here in Brooklyn. And if you're in the right place, you're at the Defund NYPD happy hour. So this is kind of a weird idea, but I figured this would be an opportunity to kind of talk about something that's really topical and something that I'm working in, and I know a lot of people are working in, and a lot of people have questions about, are interested in. So we're going to just hang out for this hour. We're going to try and unearth this issue, this topic, and go through a couple of things. And at the end, hopefully, we'll have a chance to answer some questions. But a little bit more about me. I'm running for City Council in District 39, which is 2021. So it's not this upcoming election. This is in a while from now. Currently, what I do right now for work is I work for the Center for Popular Democracy, which is like an advocacy organization. But the best way to describe it is I do grassroots organizing. So I help other grassroots groups organize on democracy issues. And essentially, these are Black and Brown-led organizations that are trying to, build power for their communities through democracy and expanding democracy. But what I used to do is I used to be a little bit of a bureaucrat because I used to work in OMB, which is the budget's part of the city government, and a little bit as a financial analyst for New York City Council. So I don't know how I ended up there, but it was kind of a long trip in terms of learning where I wanted to be, in terms of the work I wanted to do. But this kind of is a moment where I have like multiple hats, and this is like a hat from a past life that I want to bring into this organizing work and kind of talk about a little bit. So that's sort of a little bit about me, but I know like a lot of people who are involved in work, everyone's put everything down in order to work on what's going on right now. And that's what a lot of campaigns are doing. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to use this platform to kind of talk about something that I think is important. And we can have a back and forth conversation, hopefully towards the end. So, but I do want to go over a little bit of ground rules. So let's see. Okay, so housekeeping rules. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the system is everyone's going to come in and everyone's going to be muted. But what we're going to do is I'm going to try my best to sort of go through this presentation, and at the end we're going to have do questions, and we're going to do questions from the chat. So if you have questions, you can plug that into the chat, and that should be we'll be able to see that, and then we'll be able to respond to that. So if it's a question that's about something very specific that I'm talking about like at this moment, feel free to send that in. But if it's like a general longer conversation kind of question, we'll kind of save those at the end so we can just kind of have them all at once. Because this is, and the other, I guess, rule that I want to have is I love talking about this stuff, so I can go into the weeds, but I don't want to go too deep in the weeds. So if I'm going too far into the weeds, then probably is reasonable. Feel free to give me a heads up. Because we could spend the whole time just explaining the budget, and we want to talk about obviously all the larger issues and really what's going on and things that you can do yourself in order to try and change the state of affairs and how policing is done really in New York City. So we're going to try to keep a little balance between those two different things. But there's no stupid question. People are going to be coming on a very different level, so feel free to engage. And if you're on the phone or you're some other capacity, we were going to have a live stream, but the live stream doesn't quite work. So we're going to have the recorded video up later. But what we can do is, if you go to any of the social media that I have, either Facebook, if you look me up on Facebook, Brandon West for City Council, and you can just post or message me on any of those platforms, we'll be able to see and get a response to your question, if not now, sometime in the future. So let's see. And okay, so our agenda, what first we're going to do is do a little bit of introduction that we already did, but sort of just reflect a little bit of sort of what's going on, what's going on in this moment right now in the city. And um, and the next thing is we're going to just talk about what the NYC Budget Justice Campaign is. Um, and hopefully, I'm not entirely sure, but I think we have someone who's also involved in the campaign itself is going to be here and be able to talk a little bit about the campaign as well. So we'll have more than one voice kind of talking about what the NYC Budget Justice Campaign up is to date. And then after that, we're going to just try and explain the budget 101, just sort of exactly how the New York City budget works, why is it so opaque, why is it important, and what can change and what can be the future of sort of this space, and sort of why specifically policing is cost as much as it does, and why it's important to sort of change that reality. And then at the end, we'll have like a call to action, so things that you can do right now just to try and change that. And some of the stuff is moving as we speak. There's been some chatter on Twitter about some things that City Council might be doing in this front. So everything's moving, but there's still a lot that you can do. So that's sort of the framework of how we want to, have today go. But so that's just like a FYI in terms of what the agenda is. So really right now, I just kind of, one of the takeaways that I feel about sort of what just happened in the last few weeks is just kind of like, just take a moment, just kind of process that. Because like I live near Barclays Center. So I live in northern edge of Park Slope. And what the last few weeks has been really jarring, especially from that first Friday when things really changed. And that sort of spurred a lot of different activism, a lot of work for me. I mean, seeing friends be victims of police violence and have that play out was just a very different experience. It's one thing when you see it on TV, it's another thing when you see it directly in front of you. And some of these like high profile incidents that we've seen repeated over and over again happen literally like right outside of my apartment. So what we're experiencing is kind of what now is really a worldwide movement and kind of like insurrection, really. It's just like a really large like grassroots mobilization around power, like obviously about race and about access to power and brutality, but something that we really haven't seen in a long time. So something that would not be something we could talk about is not being talked about at a very large level. And this is a very unique moment, which is why I think this is like important that we talk about it, we think about it, and we try to see what we can do on this front, because this is things that groups have been spending their whole lives working on. And this focusing moment, this kind of lining up of situations that led to this opportunity. So, but we do have to like name sort of what this really is, and it's really based off a lot of trauma, and it's like a lot of trauma that like a lot of people have experienced and have deeply in them. And so we want to like give space to like acknowledge what that is, and that we're trying to build off of that legacy and try and reverse the harm that's been done in a lot of communities. So we're going to just explain the general like framework of what defunding NYPD, or what the Budget Justice Campaign is, just so like just people don't quite know really what exactly that is. They'll get a little introduction into it. But New York City budget is $89.3 billion. That's the proposed budget that is being presented by the mayor. And this is for 2021. The fiscal year starts in July 1st. So you plan your budget from July 1st to July 1st. And so that's sort of what we're starting with. And that's gone down by like 3.4 billion because of COVID, but it's believed that there's going to be, it's going to need to go down depending on what happens to the economy, because everything's changing super quickly. And the big part of that is because revenue is evaporating. So obviously people aren't going to the store, people aren't doing the things that usually generates a lot of tax revenue. And that has like a cascading effect and has impacted the city. So, but still, it costs $89.3 billion in order to meet all the services for the city to do what it does. And that is sort of what the budget is right now, and that's sort of what's being talked about. So what is a budget? A budget in the context of a city government is really like the values, that's sort of what we do, it's what services we commit to, and they're political in nature. And these are things that like make statements in themselves. And sort of a lot of when a mayor or a person comes into office, they are establishing what their values are through what they want to budget and what they don't want to budget. and who they want to talk to in creating that budget and who they don't or do in that space. So there have been cuts that have been talked about. Summer youth employment program, a lot of people talk about that being completely cut this year. There's a lot of services, but the potential is that services will be spread around even more in the future if, let's say, a quarter from now, the economic impact is reevaluated. But the cuts that have been done to policing is not particularly large. And the police budget, and we'll talk about it in more detail, but police budget was originally proposed to be $6 billion. And that's originally the mayor proposed not to make a lot of cuts. And then a little bit later, they were going to make some cuts, but weren't clear exactly about what those cuts were going to be, and move that to some youth programs. But in reality, like that is really still in the grand scheme of the 89, almost $90 billion. That's not a whole lot. So Communities United for Police Reform is a coalition of over 100 organizations. So these are like Black and brown grassroots groups that have been doing a lot of really hard work in protecting and developing their communities and making sure there's resiliency within those communities. And they've been talking about changing the way policing is through a lot of different avenues. It says the name has police reform, but I'd say a lot of groups within that coalition believe in police abolition, which is like completely reforming what policing is and also taking what is spent on policing, putting it into other services. And that is sort of who is behind it, NYC Budget Justice campaign. And that the general framework of that campaign is to take $1 billion from the current budget and to invest that into the community and different services in the community. And a lot of different groups have different visions of sort of like what they want to pull from where and why. And that's all, it depends on who you talk to, but the general framework of that is, we need to reinvest in our community. We need to, and we will not, there is a need for this policing. Like policing is a system that doesn't necessarily necessitate itself, and which is why it's gone up ridiculously, even though crime has gone down pretty regularly for a long time. So that's sort of like the general framework, and we can talk more about it, and hopefully someone from the campaign can talk a little bit as well. So that means defunding NYPD. Now, there's a lot of like talk right now in the last week, at least, about people saying like, defunding the police, like what does that mean? Like do I explain that? We've been trying to get the police on the streets for a long time, and now we want to defund it. Like, does that mean more violence in the streets? And I think that it's not complicated, but there's a bit more to sort of like the policy of it. But defunding the police means like defunding it, which just means adjusting, like taking money out of its budget. And that's the important part of the work, because there's no way to move money around unless you're taking it from somewhere. There's a finite amount of funding. So that's still a core element of what that means. But they sort of want to explain sort of exactly like what is going on. So you can see on the graph just the total spending and how expensive policing has become in New York, and sort of where the growth is, like how much has gone on into policing. The one on the right is a little harder to see, but what it says is like from Bloomberg to de Blasio, it shows the like increases in specific agencies or different parts of city government. And over his term, it's $1 billion increase from Bloomberg to de Blasio from 2019 in terms of NYPD and corrections. So that's, $1 billion, if we were to take from the current budget, goes back to where we were at Bloomberg's time. And this is when Eric Gardner was killed. So that era of policing would be $1 billion less from what we have now. So that isn't really even revolutionary, even though people were already saying you can't take $1 billion from the current budget. So I'll talk a little bit sort of like why the police budget has gone to $6 billion, but this is just to put in perspective sort of like what these changes actually are, and like how much actually has changed with the police budget right now. So that's like the general, this is the NYC Budget Justice campaign, but it's more about reinvestment, like trying to use that money and reinvest and then create this mechanism so that you don't need policing. It's alternatives to policing. And there's a lot of other research on this matter that I'll talk a little bit more as well later. So this is now I'm going to try to like make sense of sort of how this works and everything else. So again, this is sort of where questions tend to pop up. But I'll try as my best to sort of explain the annual budget process, just sort of why it's like super important that we work on this now as opposed to like any other time of the year. So there's 14-ish more days. So you would say like, wow, isn't July 1st the beginning of the budget cycle? Shouldn't that be finite? Yes, but there is, usually the budget is agreed to in principle before the actual like hour deadline to right before the new budget starts. So it's hard to make changes because there's a lot of technical work that happens in order to make that, you know, in stone. So usually it's finalized a little bit before that, sometime in the middle of the month of June. So that's sort of the time that we have left to make any significant changes to what the budget is going to be in a broad sense for next year. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no chance to change the budget, and also to talk a little bit about this budget process, but this is where the largest changes and the largest themes of what goes on in the budget happen in these few months, which is why it's very important for city council members and why it's also very important for the mayor, because this is a process that the mayor, for the most part, controls. So yeah, so the mayor has most control and power. So the mayor is presenting its budget. So this is what the mayor does. The mayor presents a budget, and the agencies essentially, you know, hold that money and they administer and manage it. And then the mayor has its office, and OMB, which is the budget part of the office, helps the agencies do that work. So that's sort of how that all works. But there's 4 financial plans. So a financial plan is like a multi-year perspective. So the adopted plan, and this is all technical stuff, and like you're not going to need to know this unless you're interested in working at OMB in all details. But generally, how this works is that there's 4 times a year when they look at the plan, the budget, and usually they'll like look at it for the year and for a couple years in the future, and then they'll make adjustments to it every quarter, where they'll be like, hey, this project is going to be moved into another year. We're not going to do this, or we need to hire more people for whatever reason in this part of the budget. So you have those adjustment periods, and that's when the agencies kind of talk to government, and they kind of suss out those changes throughout the year. So even though the adopted plan is usually where all the big changes happen, which is now, there are other times where smaller changes or different programs can come into appearance through the year. So yeah, so the plans are after the adopted reflect, you know, changes in that year estimate. So they go back and change what the adopted budget was, change the expectations on that. So in terms of like parts of the budget, so there's like expense, which are really just government services and items. So we'll talk about usually just cut into OTPS, which is other than personal staff, and then PS, which is personal staff. So this is just, you know, people and things, you know, is really how it's cut into. And then, you know, other part is obviously revenue, so tax revenue. And this is not just in the city. So this is like state revenue, you know, federal level. So these things have an impact on exactly how much money is available at any given time. So these are projections. So these projections change, and then they have to make adjustments the rest of the year. So this is why we're dealing with cuts, because the revenue projections are not good because people are not spending money. Therefore, the government has less money to use in order to pay for services. The contract budget, which is essentially part of their contractual services. So whenever government pays someone to come in to do something, that's a, you know, contract. This is like pretty much the least. This is the most opaque thing in city government sort of contracts. It's a black hole. You'll not know why things are spending as much as they are. It's hard to keep track. You know, it's a horrible mess. And generally, these things aren't readily accessible to everyday people. Like if you want to know what's going on with a, you know, building that's being built next to you, there isn't this very large document you can go and read through and I'll explain what's going on in the budget. You have to go to the website, and the website will have very basic information. It won't really tell you a lot. And then, you know, you'll be a PDF or something that you have to sift through, and, you know, the numbers are just kind of round numbers and you don't really know like what's behind that. And that's generally because no one really looks at this. And this is something that really is just done between government agencies, and they have the information to do this work. But, you know, if you wanted to go be like, how much money does the NYPD spend on tear gas? There's no actual way as a citizen to get that information without either going through a complicated set of foilings and finding hard information. And that's because that is all the money that's spent on these items are kept in different codes. So you can see how much they spend generally on either a project or generally in a bucket, but not specifically on something that, you know, you would be relevant if you would wanted to like make an argument that we should not be spending money on tear gas. We should ban tear gas usage in New York City, something like that. So this is just like a explanation of sort of like why things are so opaque. And then the only other part is like capital, which is just physical, tangible items. So like buildings, cars, bridges, the things that usually cost more than $35,000 and live for more than 5 years are considered capital budget. So that the real difference is like capital and expense. So which is like salary, you know, can be an expense. Capital, you know, can, you know, be like physical items that eventually depreciate and, you know, you can't use anymore. So I don't want to spend too much on this, but generally in January, mayor presents this budget and they start doing budget hearings for city agencies. So at City Hall, the agencies will show up, they'll sort of explain what their budget needs are. They'll send someone who knows just enough to explain the speech, but not enough to answer any questions. And this is generally how agencies treat these meetings. So then the council members get really mad at them because they can't answer basic questions about things that are going on in their districts or general problems. And this is kind of just like cat and mouse experience with government, because the agencies don't want to have to deal with accountability, and council is put in a position where it doesn't have a lot of tools to use. So this is sort of the beginning of it. Starts in January. Then in April, there's sort of a revised budget. And this is sort of when more of the hearings come back. And this is also where there's like, I call this the knife fight. There's discretionary funding. So essentially, each council member has a little access to a little bit of money themselves as individuals. And that can be for like nonprofits in their district. And that's sort of, they all start to negotiate with each other. And this is when the speaker, which has a lot of power, starts negotiating with the mayor about what priorities they want to have, or things that they want to spend, with things they don't want to spend. So this is how that plays out. And then in June is sort of when negotiations sort to like wrap up at a very like high level. And then when they usually decided, which is usually middle of the month, there's this handshake. So this is like a photo op. It's a really great photo op. Here's the photo op. It's beautiful. You see both the speaker and the mayor kind of walks down the staircase, and they part a little bit for them to come down, and they have this like handshake, and then everyone applauds, and it's really great. And then the mayor does a press conference, and the mayor essentially mansplains the budget to the press corps for like an hour. And that is essentially, thematically, is when the big buckets of the budget has been decided, but really some of the like ins and outs and details that happens after that handshake. So, but really it's hard to change the budget at a large level after the handshake, because this is pretty much they agreed, you know. So if we were going to discuss, you know, police budget, that would have to be before the handshake, which happens usually at least a week, sometimes a week and a half before the beginning of July. So that means we have a couple, like week and a half, 2 weeks to really make substantive changes to the city budget right now. Next slide. Let's see. I think I went too far. I don't know how I can fix that. Just do it this way, which is not professional, but it's Friday, and this is how we're going to roll. Okay. So, why is the NYPD budget so high? Capital projects. So there's this really cool, I should have cut a video of it, but they're doing this facial recognition program where it's CCTV. It's pretty much what they have in China, and they're already launching it in New York City. A lot of people don't know about it, but they're starting to build this project. Costs a ton of money. There's also, Bloomberg had a version of this where there are sensors around all of the bridges that can pick up trace amounts of chemicals. So if there was someone who had like a car bomb, they would be able to know just from sensors in the tunnels, from people driving in and out of the city. So these things cost a ton of money, and there's no oversight on these projects. Especially a lot of these projects are considered confidential because they can say like, oh, well, could be a terrorism related project. So the CCTV program, this could be terrorism related. So because of that, they'll put it in the confidential portion of the budget. So you won't really know about exactly how that project's working. So, but these things cost tens, hundreds of millions of dollars. I know it costs about at least $10 million for a police helicopter, which I've been listening to pretty regularly in the last few weeks since they've been parked outside of my apartment. I think the NYPD has at least 8 of those, but these are just things that cost a ton of money. Oh yeah, so the graph to the bottom essentially just shows the increase, the little dots are the increase in the budget, and it also shows the amount of employees that are in the NYPD. So you can see the real that increase is really it's $1 billion during De Blasio's term. So we're just going back to where we were before, and crime has only gone down since De Blasio has been in office. So 1,300 new officers in 2013. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of staffing, but usually an officer starts, they get around $40 or so thousand. I think that's the bare minimum that they may start, which is why a lot of them don't live in New York City. But that increases rapidly while you're on the force, and you can go to 6 figures relatively quickly. But if you include all of the pension and the benefits, that usually is doubled salary. Like in OMB, when they do headcount for a uniform agency, you're accounting for double. So if the person can eventually hit $100,000, you're spending $200,000 to hire that one person. And so that's sort of how much it costs to hire someone. So when you bring in 1,300 people, that has a long-term cost, in the future. Now, obviously people leave regularly, but that's just, something to take and consider. Police unions. Police unions I have strong opinions about them. I'm trying to bite my tongue because I've said a lot of intense things about police unions, but effectively they are very militant about getting what they want. And the smallest amounts of reform or changes, they will do work stoppages, they will picket at people's homes, they will turn their back to the mayor. They are really good about pressuring local electeds, which is a reason why a lot of council members are afraid of sort of defunding the NYPD. And they've used that power and that the degree to be really organized in order to get what they want. Headcount and overtime. So that's kind of what I've already talked about. Overtime, if you have police officers this week, they're taking in tons and tons of overtime. That's usually about half of their salary, or it can be about as high as half of someone's salary. So if you're making $100,000, a lot of times you'll find officers who are making $50,000 in overtime because they're standing around at events or things like that. There's an incoming class of cadets, so there's plans to bring in I think I don't know if it's 12 or 1,500, but we have a new officer class who will be trained in order to be full-time staff. So that is also adding to the cost, and also it's politically safe. It's there's a lot of people have historically been able to leverage cutting NYPD's budget. So when NYPD asks for things and they show up to the mayor and they make those requests, it's a lot harder to tell them no than it is maybe to tell another agency or another part of the city budget, or especially a public service, which we've developed this history of cutting over and over and over again for, since the Reagan era. There's this notion that we can sort of pick at the welfare state. So that is something that is politically easier to do than it is to do to the NYPD. So the question is so how do we get to $1 billion? How do we make the cuts to get to this level? So one, it would just be going back to pre-Bill de Blasio levels. So there hasn't been any massive shift in terms of population, in terms of life experience in New York City. Obviously things now are very different, but in general, we could be able to meet the needs of, if we wanted to do that pretty easily. So the 1 billion is not a really radical proposal. You know, trying to like completely create an alternative to policing is a more radical proposal, but even then it's not even that radical because other cities like Minneapolis are already considering these things. And this is something that we should try and move towards. Another thing that we could do to get to 1 billion is just cut the incoming class, require the agency to make changes in terms of staffing across the board. And I'll talk a little bit about how you can make those changes, you know, and then just, you know, have less officers, just have less of a headcount. That's been done to other agencies for many years. It's just not really been done to policing. And we all know like when the police did the work stoppage like strike that happened a few years ago, crime went down. So the notion that the amount of officers are necessary in order to keep down violent crime, I think is not based on necessarily fact. You can try and limit overtime, limit the usage of overtime. I know some folks have tried to piece together like an actual plan to like get to that number, and it kind of depends on who you talk to, but these are just the general things that can be done. Cutting like expensive vanity capital projects. The facial recognition program is just, we shouldn't be doing it. So that is not necessarily a vanity project, but there are capital projects that really someone just advocating for that really don't make a lot of sense. They're doing they're creating a new high-tech shooting range that they're building in New York City. I think it was part of what was going to be the 2012 Olympics, but then it got pushed back, and they were going to have like the shooting venue somewhere in the Bronx. There's a lot of capital projects, and I think that is like a starting point to like reconsider and cut these programs. These are nice to haves, they're not need to haves, even though we shouldn't even need to have them. That's a whole other conversation. And then a thing that is like an important part of this is agencies can cut their joint NYPD expenses. So if the agency that deals with, or the person that deals with making sure the monitor vendors and their licenses are the NYPD. There's no reason why an armed person with a gun needs to be making sure that a street vendor has the right license. So this is something that could be cut. The thing that is one of probably the longest things been talked about is police in schools. There's a lot of people who believe that social workers can do a lot of the situations that officers are presented in schools, and like you don't need an armed officer in a lot of the schools in New York. So there's been a long push to like remove officers from school, especially when these officers are getting more resources and more pay than the teachers themselves. So that is, trying to like change the job descriptions of these jobs. So if you just cut positions, the unions will, obviously respond to that and go into litigation. But there's belief that if you change the job description, so you require that, kind of change the title and say that requires a, social work degree for someone to be in school or something like that, it doesn't have the same legal ramifications. So there's a way that we can rethink roles that we've just assumed that policing is the right response. So like, there's no reason why if you see someone who's having a mental episode on the street or is homeless or whatever, that someone calls the NYPD and they arrest this person. And that is an escalation point. The NYPD only knows how to escalate in those situations. That's the only thing they usually tend to do because they're trained to respond to situations that way. And that is something where you can save money by hiring someone who, has skill set in dealing with people from that community to deal with those situations. And that can also extend into, if you're in different communities where there's like block parties in the summer and people are out, people are drinking and people get in fights or, arguments. Like there's people who can de-escalate, conflict that are people with guns who are trained to escalate conflict. Yeah. And that is like the alternative that people have been thinking about and talking about, which is like defunding the police is really finding community-based options that are not based off of the model that policing is based off of, which is then connects into the criminal justice system and everything else beyond that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about politics, and then we're going to get to some questions because I am talking a lot at you, and maybe we'll see if Antonine is in the call yet. So a couple of familiar folks on the screen. We have everyone's favorite mayor, and then we have Corey Johnson, who's a speaker, and then we have Laura Cumbo, who's the majority leader. So he's kind of the leader of the Democratic Party in the city council right now. So they have more sway over what goes on in general in terms of like what policy goes to vote, everything else on that front. There's also the BNT, which is a budget negotiating team. So this is like a collection of council members who kind of where the sausage is being made, talk to the speaker more regularly about what's going on in terms of budget negotiations, and they kind of give their feedback and input on that. I can get a list for any of you of who those members are. When I was there, most of them didn't pay attention to the conversation because the speaker usually just kind of made decisions on that front. I don't know what it's like now, but those are council members who have a little bit more influence on that process. And then you have council members who are either on the finance committee, but they have like even less of an influence. And then you have just any council member in general. But right now, every council member needs to be kind of weighing in on what's going on. On the right, you have grassroots groups, Communities United for Police Reform, and other folks who are the people who are galvanizing people to make change happen. And that is, we're seeing right now more influence and power from people in the streets and grassroots groups than usually what happens. If you're in this scene, you'll hear about an event or a rally, and you go to it, and it'll be on the steps of City Hall, and there'll be like 50 people, and that'll be a huge success. Now you do an event, you'll get thousands of people coming to things. I've been involved in 2 efforts. I've been involved a little bit in with a group of folks who are the former staffers who wrote the letter to the mayor about dissatisfaction, how he's really been a mayor, but specifically on these issues. And then I always got pulled into this other group, which ran the Defund the Police party that was on Williamsburg on Sunday. And, we thought we were going to get 2,000 people at that party, and we got 10,000 people at that party. So this is like the significant leverage point because people are brought into this topic, and that is a tool that all these groups are using to try and mobilize people to swaying people on the left, swaying the speaker, swaying the council members. And on the bottom, you have some of the union leadership, police union leadership. You have Pat Lynch, a bunch of schmucks. The reality is that these folks have histories of being real inflammatory and really just fighting militantly for the rights of their members, even at the expense of everyone else in the city. And that is generally, there's a lot of folks who don't consider them really part of the labor movement, but that is like a whole nother conversation. But they have a fair amount of sway in certain parts of the city. And they can have a lot of impact on local elections in those parts of the city, which is why council members feel that they can't operate independently. They have to be listening at some level to either rank and file members of these unions or the union leaderships themselves. So what you can do right now, and if any of the hosts, people helping me out, can let me know if Antonian's on, let me know that. But if not, then maybe if Theo is on, because Theo likes to talk, but if Theo's not on, we can just keep going. But so what you can do, you need to call your folks. You need to call your council members. You can probably call your parents too. Doesn't matter. You should really be communicating with people about that you care about what the city's budget is going to be next year, and that you commit to the police budget being reduced by at least $1 billion. So that is the minimum. That is not a ceiling. More can be done, and that is, you have to get direct contact with them. So you have to call them. So we can put up the city council website, but you can just put in your address and it'll show you which council member you have. But even if they're not BNT member, even if they're someone who doesn't, you wouldn't think necessarily would want to hear from you, you need to do it anyway. And I think that is still an important strategy, and their opinions are evolving right now from what I've heard, because they're hearing a lot of input from a lot of people right now. So that is still the core element of the campaign, is reaching out to specifically your council members. Some people said talk to the mayor. Mayor is the mayor right now, so it's hard to say that how important that target is, just because the mayor has been very clear in the media recently, sort of where they're standing. The leverage that's been going on with council has been impacting council, because I got a text that really during this call that there's talk that a group of council members are open to the idea of cutting it by $1 billion. So this is still a negotiation, but you need to stay on them so that they feel the pressure, so that they follow through on this negotiation and this point, because they're feeling a lot of they're feeling a lot of pressure. And the other interesting point about that is that 2/3 of city council is going to be leaving city council. They're term limited because of a weird thing that happened with term limits after we changed it and changed it back to 2 years. So effectively, some of them are trying to run for other offices, some of them trying to be mayor, some of them trying to do other things. So we have a real chance to actually effectively change and make up city council and change really like how we go into this budget process. And that could turn into bigger things, like how we even change drafting our charter, which is like our constitution. These are all things that could be on the table if you have 2/3 of council members who are really thinking aggressively and progressively about what policing could be, or really like what our city government should be. And that could evolve into taking away this like position where the mayor just has like unforeseen power in dictating what happens, and this opaqueness that makes all of us feel we don't have any power and are kind of worried. So that's kind of the real like ask, is that like there's a future that can be in front of us that involves a different dynamic of how informed our council members are, how informed you are, how much influence you have, and then how influence council members have in actually changing the functioning of government. So that is like the ask to like stay involved in this process and keep following it. I think I have another, do I have another tab? Let's see. Oh, yes. For some reason, it did not load. So this is just, if you want to go deeper on this, the Freedom to Thrive report is just a report that was done from a couple Black Lives Matter organizations, which is just a whole deeper research in terms of like reimagining safety in certain communities. And it was done by, written and researched by communities of color. And then End of Policing is a book by Alex Vitale, which is, a lot of people are reading it. I think the ebook is free right now. So it's, you can check out that book. I'm starting to get through it right now. And then IBO is the Independent Budgeting Office, which does a lot of explainers about the budget if you want to go a little bit deeper into that. So that's really it for me. So I'm really happy to go into questions unless anyone who's connected to the CPR is here wants to definitely say anything. So if you can just send a chat, we'll be able to see that and be able to respond. Let's see. Okay, all right, I just opened, I forgot exactly where the chat button is, and I saw there's 96 messages in it. Okay, so I'm going to do my best in scanning through this and answer some of these questions. So I'm going to go from the bottom. So the facial recognition program, someone just put in here, is, I don't know a ton about this, and I can actually do some follow-up and get it back to you, but effectively there's CT cameras, CC cameras throughout Manhattan and other parts of the borough, which can effectively recognize your face. And this is like in Hong Kong, this is what they were talking about there, where they can put that into back like logs if you've ever been implemented into, the criminal justice system, if you've ever been brought in for any reason. That can be used in order to make a case about, hey, you were at this location, or especially if you're at a protest. This is like how that research is done and used in some of these other countries. And for some reason, they put out this kind of like, look at this cool program we're doing kind of video on it, and kind of just told everybody that they were implementing CCTV in New York, and kind of didn't think that was going to cause a problem. So that's why I know about it, because it's like people saw this and then were sharing that this is like a thing that's coming. So that is something worth like considering, but effectively there's no law preventing us from like getting rid of it. So if we had a city council that was like very aggressive about what the rights that we wanted to have for citizens, they could propose policy that would ban facial recognition TV technology in New York City. I know some other cities are starting to go in that direction, and that's something that you should also ask your council member to do, because no one's really challenged some of these ideas. Okay, okay, is the budget going down to the wire this year? This is a very different experience. We think it will, but it will not go down to the first, because there needs to be some time after the general agreement and the actual implementation of that budget. So, which is why it's more important that if you're going to make a phone call, if you're going to show up at an event, if you're going to send a couple emails, that you do that within the next week and a half or so, as opposed to waiting to do that right at the end, just because that is something that there's this like in between time where this is when the budget analysts kind of are sleeping at the office, dealing with all the integral changes into the budget. It was very technical, so there's a lot of late nighters by city bureaucrats to get that done. So that has to happen before the first, because there's all these accounting principles that are rules, because the city almost went bankrupt in the 80s. So there's like things that people used to do which were really bad, and so deadlines matter. And there used to be a thing where some governments would take take debt bonds, and they would take this money, but they would spend things that regularly needed to get paid with things that didn't always exist. So when that money ended, they would run out of money with these things they had to keep spending on, and then the credit rating for the city dropped. So that's essentially like what happened to a person in terms of like your finances can happen to the city government. So there's all these rules in terms of like accounting and budgeting that now exist, which require these processes to be a little bit longer, I guess. So, okay. I see that Theo does not want to say anything. Thank you, Theo. Just going back through here. Let's see. If you asked your question a long time ago and you want to just re-ask it, that might help, because I'm just scrolling through all of these. Okay, like in terms of outreach tactics to council members, everything matters. It really depends on the council member. I will say phone calls and emails do get read, particularly if they're different. If it's a chain email, they won't really kind of spend time with it as much. But if it's something that you've either put in your own particular way, or you've written something handwritten, like a staffer will at least read that and will convey that to the council member generally. And because they're getting thousands and thousands of chain emails and other types of communication, if it's someone that you feel that you can like communicate in a somewhat unique way, that is always helpful. But really, like any and all type of communication is useful. Like if your council member is on Twitter, tweet at them, and if they tend to respond, I noticed some council members in Brooklyn do reply to tweets. I think they need to be held accountable as much as possible. So I think that's really an all strategy kind of thing. Okay. Seeing these questions, I'm hoping that they kind of responded, but I do want to articulate that. Let's see. Oh, okay. Sorry, Annie's question. Okay, if your council member has made some vague statements, what specifics should we be asking them to commit to? You should ask them to have they made a public statement and a comment committing to at least bringing down the budget to by $1 billion in this upcoming fiscal year, not in 4 years and not in undetermined amount of time. That is like the minimum ask that is helpful for you to ask specifically. And then out of that, what do you want to prioritize the reallocation of funding? That is, I think, the important part. Like if you want to specific on the depolicing, the getting rid of the school to prison pipeline, then that is like the follow-up you have for that. But really you need to anchor it with, at a minimum, bringing down the budget at that level, and then following that up with things that you feel that you need in your community to be supported, or you feel in communities of color that, since we're obviously talking about Black lives, this is what this is about, what kind of started this whole thing. Communities in, underutilized, underserved predominantly Black communities, protecting those communities, and push them to make an answer on like, I will cut it by at least this much. I will not vote for the budget otherwise, and I'm going to focus on increasing funding in these areas. They will not want to commit because they want to leave everything into the negotiation because they don't want to stick their neck out, but they need to feel pressure that you're going to follow up with them. If they don't follow up, if they don't do it, then you're going to show up and be like, why didn't you do this? This is the most attention we've ever had on budgeting and probably ever will have on budgeting. So that I think is like the really important ask on that front. Okay, trying my best. So yesterday, Laura Combs told me that they didn't know where the $1 billion cut came from and should be putting pressure on Stringer's office to show the council what $1 billion cut this year would look like. I mean, Stringer has no influence on the behavior of council members generally. So I think that research already exists, and I honestly think that Communities United for Police Reform have research on that. So Stringer's kind of positioning himself for his future mayoral race anyway. So like, I feel that like what Lori just gave you was a cop out. You know, so effectively, if you want to follow up and say that like, here's a plethora of organizations in the community that have like talked about sort of what this $1 billion can be. Particularly check out CPR, and I can connect you with some folks at CPR if you want to have longer conversations about what their analysis on this. But the analysis is there. So them just saying that like, oh, we can't make the cuts because we don't know what the cuts are is really just saying that like, you're not a budget analyst, so I don't have to listen to your opinions, which is like, I don't think fair because you're a citizen and your ideas are valuable. How can we make police lawsuit settlements be paid out of their pension fund? I don't know any government in the country that does that. I think that's an interesting idea. I've heard that more than once. That's something that I think is worth looking at. I feel that would have to deal with the contract negotiations, and I don't think I can think of any union that would really be willing to accept that as a change to their contract. There's some things that are just kind of like lines in the sand when it comes to those things. So I think that's a good like idea worth considering, but I don't know if there's a precedent on that. But again, the contracts are negotiated between the government and the unions themselves, so they would have to come to an agreement on that, which makes it a little harder. Okay, how can we? Okay. In terms of final vote, does the negotiation team have an extra leverage at all, or is it mostly a formality to not have too many cooks in the kitchen throughout the process? So it's a good question. The budget negotiating team isn't going to come out on a side that is different than where the speaker is at any given moment. The speaker is going to generally, if the budget negotiating team is going to be based essentially mirroring back the sentiments of the rest of council. So the rest of council's in a direction, the speaker will generally follow the rest of council. The speaker will not generally fight the budget negotiating team because the budget negotiating team generally is looking to the speaker for most of this. So there isn't usually, they're not lockstep. So that's generally what I've seen in that dynamic. Who knows if that could be different, but I still feel that like leveraging the council members is probably going to have the biggest ripple effect in this whole negotiating dynamic. Okay, so all right, a couple trying to read moving targets. Let's see. Working on a city agency that I don't think has a lot of NYPD related expenses. What should we be pushing our agency leadership to commit to? I think you should, it depends really on what agency, but you should be committing, like asking your agency to like process where they have interactions with NYPD and trying to encourage them to make commitments that they're going to continue to do that. I think that is like if you're part of a union and your union represents certain employees within these agencies, then I think you could also ask the union leadership to like make those requests to the agencies themselves. So having pressure from unions that are related to agencies can actually put pressure, not even if you're just a rank and file member of that agency itself. So getting union leadership to do that as well, I think is a major thing. Okay, Oh goodness, we're wrapping up. Okay, so just a couple like very good last second um, questions, and then we can wrap up and give you your weekend. If we continue to cut amounts of officers, would it decrease the power police unions have? I think in some ways, yes. I do feel that like that's not something that's going to change soon. I think the power of police unions is going to exist as long as we consider policing as the model that we want to deal with community safety. Um, I think that that is like a generational thing. But if we keep thinking of alternatives to policing and keep pushing those, I think um, it'll have a small impact in the same way that normal unions and worker unions throughout the United States have in the last like 50, 70 years have lost a lot of power too. That took a generation, but because people moved around and we kind of started to tear them apart, that we have this reality where a lot of unions don't have nearly as much power. And the police unions having sway over council, I've talked about that a little bit already. Um, okay, if we've contacted a council member, but unfortunately that council member has said they don't plan to make any type of commitment or statement, does it help to contact other council members who don't represent your district? If you're going to go to other council members, I would say go to the speaker. I think it's probably a better use of your time if you're going to target someone that's not your own council member. But I think that's also when you sort of like think about either targeting, either a union that you have a connection to, or like a community group, or even then just like an important figure within your community to also join you in making those comments. I think that is like also helpful, because even if they said they're not going to do it, if you show them that was like a decision that they're going to regret in the future, that has a leverage point, especially if they're coming up for re-election. So I wouldn't say that like you should probably call Corey Johnson, but you should also like call someone else who's important in your community, and that should be kind of building out a consensus on trying to find answers to these questions. Okay, we're going to be posting this on our Facebook page and probably our YouTube, but effectively, we're going to try and put up this video because we'll have it saved, so you'll be able to like go back to it. I was thinking that like no one would want to be on a call on a Friday for more than an hour, but I feel like there's a lot of questions still coming in. But this is an ongoing thing that we can continue to talk about. But I think there's like a lot of sort of intricate parts of this, and also just like what defunding the police is. It's a whole other conversation I'd love to have. But I'm if you're interested in I think on the chat we put in the information of the NYC Budget Justice Campaign. That's something you should definitely be sending your folks to, spending your time to. There's a lot of resources on that website, and we put a couple other things in there that you can connect to. So really encourage you to like try to make one ask, try to call someone, try to talk to somebody within the time that we have next few weeks, and hopefully we'll see what happens, and hopefully we'll see you out in the streets. And I myself, I have put in some information. westforcouncil.com is my website, so if you want to sign up, see some other things I'm going to put out. I'm going to try to put out another video about this content and these issues that's going to be available in the future, so you can sign up there. Otherwise, thank you for participating. Thank you for being here. I'm going to finish my drink and start my weekend. But otherwise, yeah, thanks for taking time and talk about budgeting, and hopefully we'll see if we can defund the NYPD.